Hello and welcome back to Hex Ed Oz, where the sexiest thing you can be is a massive nerd. Shout out once again to the very talented Ben Harrison AKA Jankbox for providing the music you're hearing right now. Check him out on bandcamp.com. And thank you so much to the folks who've already visited my Patreon, provided feedback and encouragement, and shared these episodes. Your support means more than you know. Today I want to cover conflict, in a LARPing sense, and why you absolutely must seek it out to get the most from your LARPing experience. I'll be coming at this from the perspective of someone attending a traditional story-driven game, one where narrative is imperative. But I do want to briefly mention that there are LARPs that avoid conflict in favor of a more cozy, picnic-esque sort of vibe. One that I would absolutely recommend is the Hobbit Hoedown based in Victoria, where you can expect party games, baking, and just general merrymaking. And no, Saruman is not likely to be hiding out there. Aside from LARPs in that style, whether drawing swords or launching barbed compliments across a dance hall, expect conflict to lie at the heart of your LARP experience. It's simple, really. Storytelling is all about conflict. I mean, look at the classic tales. The knight must rescue the princess from a dragon. Here we have a physical conflict, with a threat of failure and even death. Romeo and Juliet. They must defy their warring families, conflict with them, you might say, to indulge in their forbidden romance. Imagine if the dragon just handed the princess over. Imagine the Montagues and Capulets were just good neighbours and not trying to kill each other. Would you want to read those stories? Would they even be long enough to bother reading? Protagonists must always be seeking to overcome something, to rail against something. They must be threatened by something, else they're never given the chance to be heroes. And this is important for all LARPers to remember. LARP, unless merely a battle game, is about group storytelling, and you are the protagonist. It's up to you to show everyone what your protagonist is made of. The issue is that real people tend to fear failure, negative consequences, and judgment. And when you're the one physically standing in the firing line, it can be a lot harder to act than it is when you're just describing hypothetical actions and rolling dice. Not to mention, you can't fall back on a generous DM if you try something at a LARP and it just doesn't quite work, because there is no DM screen. This can lead to players freezing up or waiting for interactions to come to them, which can then lead to a distinct lack of content or engagement for that player, not to mention everyone they are not interacting with. And today's episode is all about fixing that problem. We game runners want our players to leave every single session saying, "Holy shit, I had so much going on, I have loads of story to recount." Not, "I didn't try to steal the crown, because I just knew I wouldn't succeed anyway, An example I used when speaking to players at Cicadia recently was this. Let's say you pay to enter an escape room. Now, you may not beat all the puzzles, but in knowing this, do you stand in the first section and wait for someone to come in and tell you how it all works? Or do you make an effort to justify spending money to be there? And if you do fail to complete the room, does it really matter to anyone but you? Did you at least have fun engaging with the puzzles? Is it not somewhat entertaining to look back at what you did wrong and laugh about how obvious it seems in hindsight? Treat LARPing the same way. Get your money's worth from the hobby. But how, you might ask, do I go about doing that when I'm such an emotional entity prone to all those human tendencies already mentioned? The first thing you should always remind yourself is that your character is not you. Their failures, while enacted by you, are not a reflection upon you as a person. Nor will they follow you into the real world. Your character can sustain wounds and lose coin, and at the end of the day, you hang up your costume, maybe give it a wash too. And it's very much like closing a novel, ready to pick up with the next chapter during your next session. Remember also that LARP is a physical activity, and all physical activities take time and practice to get good at. But you have to miss a few kicks to get good at soccer. And you have to lose some battles, get yelled at, or have your stuff stolen by rogues to become a better LARPer. The thing is, you have to attempt those kicks in the first place to start that process. Get what I'm saying? The next thing to recall is that every character you interact with, like you, is just a real person playing a role. They might be really convincing, even a bit scary or shocking, but it's all an act. In the workplace, lots of people avoid conflict with loud, obnoxious, angry co-workers because there's a genuine fear of harm, whether physical or emotional. But what if you knew that bully was just pretending to be an asshole? It doesn't entirely negate the discomfort they can cause, but it would certainly change the way you react to them, yeah? Maybe even allow you to reciprocate with some attitude of your own? Maybe say those scathing retorts you've been holding in. When entering a LARP conflict scenario, look at your rivals or foes and say to yourself, you know what? They're just putting on a show, and I'm allowed to give back as much as I take. Here's another thing to consider. Everything we're doing is make-believe. All the relics and rewards provided by game runners are simply that, theatre props to help tell the story. Your character can lose everything they've ever accumulated during multiple sessions of play, and it really doesn't matter because, okay, maybe now you can't afford that spicy item, but can you still play the game at all? 100%. And you really haven't lost any of your own actual personal belongings. You've lost the equivalent of tokens in a board game. I know that players often identify so closely with their character that a loss for one feels like a loss for the other, but if you take a step back and say, it's all pretend, you might find it easier to jump back into the action rather than become paralyzed by the human tendency to, well, sulk. Next, we should address that fear of judgment. So long as you make an effort to speak to members of your LARP community outside of play, especially if you're congratulatory of their efforts and successes, folks will get to know the difference between your character's actions and behaviors and your own. Thus, they will start to judge the two entities separately rather than as an amalgamation. When you know that it's your character copping the blame for things, not you, this can make it easier to lean into the story for good or for ill. Plus, projecting positivity and a willingness to banter off the field, whether you truly feel it or not, is a great way to assuage hurt feelings and cultivate a forgiving atmosphere in the people around you. Consider whether you want to be an active or reactive protagonist in your own story. What the hell does that mean? Well, consider Harry Potter in his first book. He's dragged into the wizarding world by others and spends a good portion of the story learning magic, yeah, but mostly acting as a surrogate for the reader, a vessel through which we learn about the setting while things just sorta happen around him. That is a reactive protagonist, and they are a valid character choice. But compare Harry to Locke Lamora of the Gentleman Bastard series. He is always in action, setting up a heist, fighting for his life when it all goes pear-shaped, then immediately improvising a new plan. He is an active protagonist. And if the two were portrayed by LARPers, I know which one I'd prefer to be. The one that is always doing exciting things, not always well, but doing them nonetheless. Along the same lines, don't be afraid to throw the first punch. Not literally, you violent cretins. Like our buddy Locke, by constantly moving towards adversity and challenges, you not only force the story to take you into account and change based on your actions, but you tend to draw others in. Maybe your friends following in your wake. Maybe your opponents now needing to scramble to fix what you've broken. Regardless, by making the first move, you've kicked the pebble that starts an avalanche. And if you don't succeed, you've still given a bunch of other players some sweet, sweet content to sink their teeth into. Trust me, they'll thank you for it, even if they don't think to verbalize their thanks. I realize that I've been harping on about scenarios in which you put effort in, step willingly into conflicts, with the assumption that failure will occur. But you know what? Sometimes you'll win. In fact, from the early bird to Sun Tzu, it is acknowledged that those who act decisively will often succeed where others, slower to react or unwilling to try, will not. Even if your scheme was ad hoc or intended for comedy rather than serious victory. I see it myself every single time I run an event. LARPers who square up to the villain or launch themselves into a seemingly unwinnable fight, coming out on top purely because no one expected them to try. Never underestimate the power of surprise, momentum, and a little insane hopefulness. On the other side of the coin, we have unwillingness to win. The majority of the time when I encounter this attitude, it stems from the player not wishing to spoil someone else's day. They don't want to fight that bandit because they know under the mask is a real person and they don't want to hurt their feelings. But this is where I want you to be just a little bit selfish, okay? Sure, if you know that bandit never gets a win, throwing them a bone can make for a lovely gesture. But not fighting them at all? Now, not only is that bandit not learning from defeat, now they're not LARPing at all. If you're really concerned about others' feelings to the point that you don't let yourself succeed, you should still make an effort, no matter how soft that effort might be. But I seriously want you to ask yourself, is this approach really fair to you? Why don't you deserve the treasure or the accolades? I think you do. And if that player gets upset or salty, maybe point them towards this podcast, yeah? Or offer to help them improve for next time. Better a loss and a new mentor/friend than no gameplay or an obvious pity win. Those suck. We are nearly at the end, folks, but here I want to veer back to the very beginning. Tell yourself before every LARP game, I deserve to be part of a good story. Conflict needs to occur to make a story worth telling. It doesn't matter if you get to brag at the end, so long as you were part of something memorable. So go looking for those hurdles and just jump. But what if you're really just unable to deal with conflict? I get it, I really do. A lot of us in the community are conflict avoidant, anxious, depressed from time to time, and telling that horrific ogre to get nicked can send us into a full-blown panic or make us reconsider attending. As always, if you struggle in these situations, I recommend real-world therapy, but I also want you to reach out to your friends and discuss the situation. They might be more than willing to back you up or even take the blowback of your character's actions. They might help you to figure out which scenarios you can handle and which you can afford to avoid. I mean, you don't have to be in constant conflict. You might not be comfortable in a shouting match, but maybe a conflict settled by sending snarky letters back and forth is more your speed. It's worth reaching out for help, and if the only thing your buds can do is remind you of the points we've covered today, then so be it. That's still something. And with enough exposure to the hobby, combined with enough reminders that it's all just pretend, you may find yourself becoming progressively better at handling conflict. And I don't mean just narratively, but also in your real life. A final thought. Lethal LARPs. I attended a game called After the Fall many years back, and on the very first day, my character was gunned down and eaten by cannibals. I can well imagine that the fear of permanent character death might cause some players to revert to that inactivity and avoidance of conflict, but this is where it's important to prepare yourself and manage your expectations based on the type of LARP you're attending. Cicadia is a game where death is uncommon, so there is less need to fear conflict in general. After the Fall was a game with a very high chance of mortality, so while I was disappointed to lose the character so quickly, I was at least prepared with a backup or two. And that's the thing. Even death at a LARP is not the end of your ability to tell stories. The way I look at what happened, by putting that first character into conflict, I got to tell a short story of how wild and dangerous that world was, almost like an epilogue to the rest of the event. Not to mention, I probably helped those cannibals continue their story in a realistic and hopefully satisfying way. Plus, my second character got into all sorts of shenanigans immediately after, including holding up a cafeteria with a squeezy stress ball. Long story, but a good story. And I get to tell it because I didn't shy away from the trouble that was bound to result, and I didn't let an initial loss deter me from trying harder. I hope this has been another helpful episode, folks, and if it was, please don't forget to like the podcast, leave some comments, rate it if you can, and join me on Patreon. I've been Chris, this has been Hex Ed Oz, and I hope to see you all again real soon. Bye!